Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 7th of January. Today we're doing a frontline update, mainly focusing on Maryinka, Avdiivka, and the Bakhmut fronts. We're going to begin by looking at Maryinka, where there is a minor change to the front line. The previous front line really ran along Maryinka's municipal boundaries, and on the 6th of January, the Russian forces did conduct an advance, capitalizing on their positions in Ivano-Franka streets to continue advancing westwards into Maryinka itself, which is now the Ukrainian frontline position. And they were able to overrun Ukraine's forward operating base within the Orthodox Church compound, where there are several structures that are still standing, or at least have some ruins that could be used as cover. And meanwhile, when you compare that to the rest of the streets, it's just completely decimated. Really, a lot of these houses were just wiped off the map or have a little bit of rubble remaining with them. So now the Russian forces are making use of this compound for their own forward positions, and they were struck by the 46th Brigade, which is a Ukrainian air assault brigade that fought in the summer counteroffensive in between Robotyne and Verbove. It was moved, I believe, a month ago to this part of the front line to assist the Ukrainian 79th Air Assault Brigade, which has been defending in Novomikhailivka and Maryinka for over a year now. So you could see how the Ukrainians shifted their priorities really even a month ago, or maybe even before that, to defensive operations in the Donbass versus what they were previously doing with these units in their southern counteroffensive. And so in this video, you can see the FPVs hitting the ruins of that church, confirming the Russian advance. Now looking further north, you'll see that according to DUSA maps, the Russians were able to get control over this agricultural facility, which was probably a Ukrainian forward position, which was being used to put pressure on Maryinka's northern flank. And so that's the rationale behind clearing out the tree line and the trenches that are built around the warehouses that now Russia has under their control. And an additional factor is that now this opens up a new vector of attack for the Russians in the direction of this local height. So it's not that high on elevation, this height that I'm marking in the yellow rectangle. But in any case, when you compare it to the surrounding elevation, for instance, around the Ukrainian defensive positions in the trenches within Krasnohorivka, the city over here, or in Maryinka, it is actually on rather high elevation. It's also, when you compare it to some of the open fields in the region and some of the supply lines that are connecting the Ukrainian forward operating nodes, for instance, the road connecting Maryinka to Krasnohorivka. And so, yeah, that's some of the rationale. The Russian forces would like to get control over this dominant height to give them a proper field of vision and to directly target the Ukrainian positions that are in a relatively narrow area within Maryinka, not just directly, but also from the northern flank. Now, moving on to Avdiivka, we don't have many territorial changes, but I do want to show you guys this geolocated footage. It's on my map, of course. And this shows that the Russian forces were shelling a Ukrainian squad operating around this quarry at this specific location. What this shows us is that the Ukrainians do still have a forward presence very close to Avdiivka's tree lines, dachas, industrial district, in an area where the Russian forces had already formed a salient. And this is important because it was previously imagined by some that the Russian forces got control over this quarry and then used that as a launching point to get into the foothold in the southern parts of Avdiivka's residential areas. I never mapped accordingly to that. I was under the belief that this was sort of a gray zone, just because the quarry is in a very depressed elevation in compared to the surrounding regions, especially in comparison to the industrial zone. And so it made no sense for the Russian forces to enter into that area, especially when it was just at ground zero in the gray zone. It doesn't make much sense. But now we know that the Russians likely bypassed the quarry and advanced into the southern roads of Avdiivka through the dachas and through the industrial district directly. And what this also means is that the Ukrainians do still have a presence on the easternmost flank of the Tsarska Ochota territory fortification system in this region. And this fortification system, it's built up in a wooded area. It's the salient that the Ukrainians have been holding on to for several months now, despite intense Russian pressure and bombardment from the east and from the south, especially from the south. But nonetheless, by protecting the eastern flank, it is preventing additional pressure from being put on and helps the Ukrainians maintain their current forward positions. And in terms of salients, there's also a very similar theme with the Ukrainian defensive position around this abandoned air defense base, which now the Ukrainians have turned into a tunnel system and a fortification system. And by protecting the flanks in this very narrow area, the Ukrainians have been able to maintain this forward position, which prevents the Russians from shifting focus to attacking further northwards to the supply lines of Avdiivka or to the Chimik district of Avdiivka itself. And then looking at Avdiivka's southern flank, again, the Russian forces have reduced the scale of their infantry-based assaults, and in terms of armored assaults, those have basically evaporated over the past month, really because of the dense minefields that were placed by the Ukrainians, not just in the direct entrances to these villages like Severne and Tonenke, but also on the flanks where the Russian forces did try to develop breakthroughs to take over the supply lines into southern Avdiivka, but also to take over these villages. And so eventually the Russians understood the futility of doing that in the same sector and really did reduce the scale of their attacks, and in turn reduced significantly the amount of vehicles that were being lost on a daily basis. So material damage is down in this area, but on the flip side, the changes in this area are basically zero at the moment. And then if we look north at where the Russians really are intensifying right now, they are putting pressure directly on Avdiivka from the north. You could see there's already reports that the Russian forces have been able to take over this area, which would mean that they're able to connect, in essence, the forward positions from Kamyanka to the Tarakan slag heap. Of course, this road is just extremely close to the line of contact, so it can't be used on a safe basis throughout the entire day to move troops and supplies around. But if it could be secured, then it would be a way to shorten the transport to the front line and further coalesce Russian forces on the northern flank as the Russian forces begin to penetrate deeper into the dachas that are, again, extremely fortified. So the Russians are really attacking these fortified areas head on, but it would allow them to expand control into these dachas, not just on infantry-based assaults, but now we're beginning to see footage of Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles entering these areas through the roads and engaging with the Ukrainian defenders. And so we're also seeing that to a certain extent around the Avdiivka coke plant, but that's less of a concern for the Russians. And at the same time, if we look at Stepova, the front line really has stabilized, with the Russian forces getting a foothold in the eastern parts of that village and the Ukrainians the western side, which is a significant gray zone. Really, the reason why the Russians can't further expand is for some of the reasons are pretty similar to why the Russians can't advance on the southern flank of Avdiivka around Tonenke, and that's really because of the minefields around Stepove, in the fields around it, and also directly towards it. Also because the Ukrainians did pour in a lot of brigades into defending the sector, most notably the 47th Mechanized Brigade, but there were several others you could see on my map. So that manpower was able to hold the line. And you also have several other factors like movement of artillery and FPVs to this area, and also Stepova being on relatively low elevation compared to surrounding areas. Some of those surrounding areas are under Russian control, which is an advantage, but you do still have some positions that the Ukrainians hold around Berdichi, not in Berdichi, but around it, that are on high elevation overlooking Stepove. So all in all, it does yield significant casualties, just the daily process of fighting in that region at ground zero of the front line. But nonetheless, those positions that the Russians were able to create for themselves since the beginning of the offensive on October 10th are still important, because these positions are being used as forward firing points to attack the supply lines that are leading into Avdiivka. And more generally, like looking into the future, this would be the first attack vector that the Russians would use to attack further north into the village of Ocheretine, which is located on an extremely high elevation in comparison to the surrounding areas. Now, moving on to the Bakhmut front, we have a minor change around here. We have this geolocated video from today, actually, released by Ukraine's 24th IR Battalion. Their FPV hit a Russian soldier in a tree line, which has lost a lot of foliage. It shows once again that the Russian forces have been able to expand their presence in some of these forested areas that the Ukrainians previously held. The Russians really advanced directly through these forested areas to create their attack vector to take over the height 215.7, which at the moment there's some ambiguity. I haven't seen a lot of reports elaborating on the situation at this height, but to my knowledge, it seems like the Russian forces do still continue to hold a foothold in a large chunk of the fortification system, but that certain sections of it are still in a gray zone. For the most part, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from it, which does leave them in a tenuous position within Klishivka. But at the same time, the Ukrainians do still have support from the west, from the western flank, along the heights that are overlooking Klishivka from there. So on a larger scale, they do still receive support from that area, but on a local level, it is still a significant loss, and they're not able to take advantage of height 215. And finally, we're going to look at Bodanivka. There is geolocated video which shows the Ukrainians firing their M777 howitzers. So let's add one more seven. Shelling Russian positions in Bodanivka, which shows the Russians are now setting up permanent encampments over here. And for the most part, the shelling videos from the Ukrainians have been from the northernmost outskirts, so there's no indication of Russia advancing any further south than we previously imagined. But now the visual evidence is coming out, and this video is released by Ukraine's 45th Artillery Brigade. And the artillery situation in Bakhmut is very fascinating because this has been an area where the Russian forces throughout the past over a year now have really poured in a lot of artillery resources. A lot of artillery barrels and shells have been expended in the battles of Soledar and Bakhmut, and the Russians do hold one of their largest artillery superiorities on this part of the front line, which is why the Ukrainians are now relying a lot on some of these artillery brigades to try to respond in kind to the best of their extent to fire at Russian positions as they're advancing. So you have the 45th doing that, and then when you zoom out to a larger extent, you have several other Ukrainian artillery units that are in the wider Donbass front. So you have 107th Rocket Artillery Brigade and the 43rd Heavy Artillery Brigade generally in this region, and there's a couple others that are operating around Klishivka at the moment. And so that's all out for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.